Episode 1: The Forgotten Bombing of Wall Street. In the heart of New York City, on September 16, 1920, a quiet weekday morning turned into chaos. Wall Street, the symbol of American finance, erupted in a thunderous blast as a horse-drawn wagon filled with explosives detonated right outside the J.P. Morgan building. Shattered glass rained from skyscrapers, office workers fled in terror, and in less than a minute, more than 30 people were dead and hundreds wounded. Yet today, almost no one remembers this attack that once shook America to its core. The government quickly blamed anarchists, immigrants, and radicals who opposed the rise of American capitalism. Flyers found nearby threatened retribution against Wall Street's oppressors, fueling suspicion toward Italian anarchist groups. But despite one of the largest investigations of its time, no one was ever convicted. The bombing left deep scars, not just on the buildings, but on the nation's psyche. It became a turning point for Wall Street, which reinforced security and embraced secrecy. Ordinary workers who survived described the scene as a storm of iron and blood, yet their voices faded as the event was overshadowed by later conflicts. The Wall Street bombing remains a chilling reminder that terrorism on American soil didn't begin with 9/11. It began long before, targeting symbols of power, wealth, and influence. What makes this story even more shocking is how it quietly slipped through the cracks of history, rarely mentioned in textbooks or documentaries. Why? Perhaps because the truth was inconvenient, tied to class struggle, political rebellion, and an America unwilling to acknowledge its internal enemies. To this day, if you walk by 23 Wall Street, you'll see faint pockmarks in the building's stone walls, silent scars left by the blast more than a century ago. Few notice them, fewer still ask what caused them. Yet behind those marks lies one of America's earliest and most mysterious terrorist attacks. And in the silence surrounding it, we glimpse the beginning of a long history of shocking truths hidden in plain sight. Episode 2: The Oklahoma City Bombing's Hidden Layers. April 19th, 1995. A sunny morning in Oklahoma City began like any other, until a massive explosion tore through the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The blast was so powerful that it destroyed a third of the building, killed 168 people, including 19 children, and injured hundreds more. It remains one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. Officially, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were identified as the masterminds, motivated by rage against the federal government for incidents like Waco and Ruby Ridge. But beneath the official narrative, disturbing layers remain concealed from public memory. McVeigh, a decorated Gulf War veteran, harbored a deep distrust of federal authority. He believed the government had overstepped its power, particularly after the Waco siege, where dozens of men, women, and children died in flames. His decision to load a Ryder rental truck with nearly 5,000 pounds of explosives wasn't random. It was calculated, symbolic, and intended to strike fear at the heart of American governance. Yet many survivors later revealed haunting details that didn't make headlines. Unexplained secondary explosions, reports of additional suspects, and files that vanished from the public record. Some believe the full story has never been told. In the aftermath, the bombing reshaped America's sense of security. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act was passed, expanding federal surveillance powers. Federal buildings nationwide installed barriers, reinforced structures, and imposed new security measures. But what made the tragedy unforgettable were the personal stories. Parents searching desperately for their children in the rubble of the daycare. Survivors who crawled out of twisted steel and concrete. Ordinary citizens rushing into danger to save strangers. The Oklahoma City bombing left deep scars that still linger. A memorial now stands at the site, with 168 empty chairs, each one representing a life taken. Yet for many Americans, the attack has faded from memory, overshadowed by later tragedies like 9/11. The uncomfortable truth is that domestic terrorism, driven not by foreign enemies, but by American citizens themselves, has long been part of the nation's story. And sometimes, the official version of events is just the beginning, leaving unanswered questions that haunt survivors and historians alike. Episode 3: The San Isidro McDonald's Massacre. On July 18, 1984, in the quiet border town of San Isidro, California, an ordinary summer afternoon turned into one of the darkest days in American history. At around 3:40 p.m., a man armed with multiple firearms stormed into a crowded McDonald's restaurant. Within 77 minutes, he unleashed a reign of terror that left 21 people dead and 19 wounded, making it one of the deadliest mass shootings in the United States at the time. Yet today, this tragedy is rarely remembered, overshadowed by newer and more publicized acts of violence. The gunman, James Huberty, was a 41-year-old welder who had recently lost his job. Neighbors described him as unstable, deeply paranoid, and obsessed with the idea that society had abandoned him. The day before the attack, he told his wife he believed something terrible was about to happen, and when she asked what he meant, his chilling reply was, "I'm going hunting. Hunting humans." The next day, he carried out those words in brutal fashion. Family inside the McDonald's were caught completely off guard. Parents shielded their children, workers hid behind counters, and some tried to crawl toward exits under a hail of gunfire. Survivors later recalled the chaos with trembling voices, the sound of bullets piercing walls, the screams of the wounded, and the eerie silence that followed moments of carnage. Police eventually ended the massacre when a SWAT sniper fatally shot Huberty, but by then, the devastation was complete. The aftermath raised urgent questions about mental health, gun control, and how American society often overlooks warning signs. Despite multiple red flags in Huberty's behavior, no effective system caught him before tragedy struck. In time, the McDonald's where the massacre happened was demolished, replaced by a community college and a memorial honoring the victims. Yet the San Isidro massacre remains a largely forgotten chapter in America's struggle with mass violence. What makes this event especially haunting is not just the number of victims, but the silence that followed. For decades, the story was rarely mentioned outside the local community, as if the nation wanted to bury the memory. But for the families who lost loved ones, and for the survivors who still carry scars, the echoes of that day never fade. Their stories remind us that terrorism and mass violence are not always political. They are sometimes deeply personal, erupting from despair, anger, and isolation. And often, those stories are the ones history forgets first. Episode 4: The Bath School Disaster Few Recall. On May 18, 1927, in the small farming community of Bath Township, Michigan, the quiet rhythm of rural life was shattered by the deadliest school massacre in American history, an event almost erased from collective memory. Unlike modern attacks with guns, this one relied on explosives. Andrew Kehoe, a local school board treasurer, meticulously planned an attack that killed 45 people, including 38 children, and injured more than 50 others. To this day, the Bath school disaster remains one of the most devastating acts of domestic terrorism on U.S. soil. Kehoe was known as a meticulous, even-tempered man, but behind his calm exterior burned resentment. Facing financial ruin and angered by rising taxes, he blamed the school board for his hardships. Over several months, he secretly planted hundreds of pounds of dynamite and pyritol beneath the school's foundation. On that fateful morning, the bombs exploded, tearing through classrooms filled with children. The roof collapsed, trapping dozens under rubble. Survivors later recalled the scene as a war zone, with parents digging frantically through debris, their hands bleeding, desperate to find their children. As rescue workers struggled to save lives, Kehoe himself drove up in his truck, loaded with even more explosives. Without warning, he detonated the vehicle, killing himself and several others, including the school superintendent. The blast was so strong, it sent bodies and debris flying across the field, amplifying the horror of the day. What makes the Bath disaster particularly shocking is how quickly it faded from the national consciousness. Despite its magnitude, it is rarely mentioned in American history books. Perhaps it is because the attack didn't fit neatly into political narratives. Kehoe was not part of an organized group, nor was he motivated by ideology in the traditional sense. His act was personal, rooted in grievance, resentment, and despair. Yet it showed that terror could come from within, and that even the most innocent spaces could become targets. Today, a small memorial stands in Bath Township honoring the victims, but few Americans outside the region have ever heard of the tragedy. The scars of that day still linger in the families who lost generations, in the soil where the school once stood, and in the silence of history itself. The Bath school disaster is not just a forgotten massacre, it is a chilling reminder that violence can erupt from the most ordinary of places, carried out by someone no one ever suspected. Episode 5. The Puerto Rican Nationalist Attacks. In the mid-20th century, long before the era of global terrorism dominated headlines, America faced a wave of attacks that came not from abroad, but from its own territories. The Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, seeking independence from the United States, carried out a series of violent operations that shocked the nation, but have since slipped from popular memory. Their campaign of terror, driven by frustration with colonial rule, culminated in bold attacks that struck at the very heart of American power. On November 1, 1950, 4 Puerto Rican nationalists stormed the Blair House in Washington, D.C., where President Harry Truman was staying during White House renovations. Armed with pistols, they exchanged gunfire with Secret Service agents in a dramatic shootout. Truman narrowly escaped death, but the attempt sent ripples of fear through the country. Less than 4 years later, in 1954, another group of Puerto Rican nationalists opened fire from the visitors' gallery of the U.S. House of Representatives, wounding 5 congressmen in the middle of a legislative session. The images of blood-stained desks and stunned lawmakers seared themselves briefly into national headlines before being buried by the tide of Cold War events. For the nationalists, these attacks were not random acts of violence, but carefully staged political statements. They wanted the world to see Puerto Rico's struggle for independence, to force Americans to confront the costs of their empire. But for many ordinary Americans, the attacks felt like a betrayal, an assault from within the U.S. family itself. Survivors of the congressional shooting described the chaos vividly: papers flying, lawmakers diving for cover, and the chilling echo of gunfire in the halls of democracy. Despite the seriousness of these events, the attackers were not executed. Instead, most were sentenced to long prison terms, only to be released decades later after political campaigns called for clemency. By then, their cause had faded, and Puerto Rico remained under U.S. control. The attacks left behind scars, physical and political, but also a peculiar silence. Few Americans today remember that armed men once tried to kill a sitting president, or that gunfire once erupted in Congress, long before January 6, 2021. The Puerto Rican nationalist attacks reveal an uncomfortable truth. Terrorism in America has not always come from external enemies. Sometimes it has come from within its own borders, carried out by those who demanded freedom in the most violent way possible. And the fact that these events are so rarely discussed today shows how quickly even the most dramatic assaults can be erased when they do not fit the story a nation wants to tell about itself. Episode 6. The Atlanta Olympics Bombing. On the evening of July 27, 1996, crowds gathered in Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta to celebrate the Summer Olympics. Music filled the air, families enjoyed food and festivities, and the world's eyes were fixed on a symbol of global unity. Then, at 1:20 a.m., a pipe bomb hidden inside a backpack exploded, killing 2 people and injuring more than 100 others. Panic spread through the park as screams echoed against the backdrop of shattered glass and sirens. What was supposed to be a festival of peace had been turned into a scene of terror. The bombing was the work of Eric Robert Rudolph, a militant extremist who later admitted he wanted to use the attack to embarrass the U.S. government and disrupt the Olympics. He saw the games as a symbol of globalism and federal power, both of which he despised. But in the hours after the bombing, confusion clouded the investigation. A security guard named Richard Jewell, who had actually discovered the suspicious backpack and helped evacuate people, was wrongly accused by the FBI and media. For weeks, his name was smeared across headlines as the suspected bomber. He endured public humiliation, endless scrutiny, and personal torment, only to be cleared later when Rudolph was identified as the true culprit. The attack raised profound questions about how terrorism can strike at moments meant to showcase human unity. Survivors described the scene as chaos in slow motion, parents clutching children, wounded victims lying in pools of blood, and rescuers working desperately under the glare of floodlights. For Atlanta, the bombing scarred the memory of what should have been a proud Olympic moment. For America, it was a reminder that terrorism was not confined to embassies overseas or political targets, but could erupt at a celebration where ordinary people gathered. The attack raised profound questions about how terrorism can strike at moments meant to showcase human unity. Survivors described the scene as chaos in slow motion, parents clutching children, wounded victims lying in pools of blood, and rescuers working desperately under the glare of floodlights. For Atlanta, the bombing scarred the memory of what should have been a proud Olympic moment. For America, it was a reminder that terrorism was not confined to embassies overseas or political targets, but could erupt at a celebration where ordinary people gathered. Episode 7. The Sterling Hall Bombing. On the night of August 24, 1970, the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison was rocked by a thunderous explosion. A stolen van, packed with nearly 2,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, detonated outside Sterling Hall, a building that housed the Army Mathematics Research Center. The blast was so powerful that it shattered windows across campus, killed a young researcher named Robert Fastnacht, and injured several others. It was the largest act of domestic terrorism in America at the time, yet today, few outside Wisconsin even know it happened. The attack was carried out by 4 men: David Fine, Leo Burt, Carl Armstrong, and Dwight Armstrong, students and activists radicalized by their opposition to the Vietnam War. They believed the Army Math Research Center was complicit in developing technologies used for military operations, and they saw the bombing as a way to strike back at U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. But their plan, intended as a political statement, instead resulted in the tragic death of an innocent man who had no connection to military research. Sterling Hall's ruins were eventually repaired, but scars from that night linger in memory. The bombing highlighted the danger of radicalization, showing how righteous anger can twist into violence that claims innocent lives. For decades, the story was whispered more than told, overshadowed by larger events like the Kent State shootings or the Watergate scandal. Yet the Sterling Hall bombing remains a chilling reminder that terrorism in America has worn many faces, sometimes even those of college students who once marched for peace. In the hours after the explosion, chaos gripped the campus. Students poured into the streets, stunned by the destruction. Survivors recalled ceilings collapsing, glass raining down, and the eerie silence that followed the roar of the bomb. For many, it felt like the war in Vietnam had suddenly come home to American soil. The aftermath of the Sterling Hall bombing was complex. 2 of the bombers, Carl and Dwight Armstrong, were captured and served prison sentences, while David Fine was arrested years later. Leo Burt, however, disappeared and remains one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives, his fate still unknown. The incident forced the nation to confront a troubling reality, that acts of terror could come not only from extremists on the far right, but also from those who claim to be fighting for justice and peace. Episode 8. The Unabomber's Silent War. For nearly 2 decades, from 1978 to 1995, America lived under the shadow of an elusive figure who became both feared and strangely mythologized: the Unabomber. His real name was Theodore Ted Kaczynski, a former mathematics prodigy who had once taught at the University of California, Berkeley. Retreating into a tiny cabin in the Montana wilderness, Kaczynski waged a campaign of terror by mailing homemade bombs to universities, airlines, and businesses. His attacks killed 3 people and injured 23, leaving a nation unsettled by the fact that such violence could come quietly, through the mail. What made Kaczynski particularly terrifying was not just his skill at crafting bombs, but his ability to evade capture. Investigators struggled for years, chasing hundreds of false leads, while Americans opened packages with growing suspicion. His bombs were meticulously designed, often disguised in wood or metal casings, and delivered unexpected destruction. Survivors spoke of the horror of sudden explosions ripping through offices, laboratories, and even the hands of those simply opening their mail. Kaczynski wasn't motivated by random hatred. He was driven by ideology. In 1995, he forced major newspapers to publish his manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future. In it, he argued that modern technology and industrialization were destroying human freedom and the natural world. His writings were chilling, but also strangely persuasive to some, sparking debates about whether society had ignored warning signs in its pursuit of progress. But behind the intellectual argument lay a trail of suffering, families shattered, lives changed forever, and a nation forced to realize that terrorism could come from a solitary figure, not just organized groups. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Kaczynski's brother recognized the writing style of the manifesto and alerted the FBI. In 1996, agents surrounded his remote Montana cabin, where they found his journals, bomb-making materials, and evidence of years of planning. The image of Kaczynski being led away, bearded, disheveled, a recluse, shocked the world. This was not a foreign terrorist or political revolutionary, but an American genius who turned his intellect toward destruction. The Unabomber saga left deep marks on America. It reshaped how law enforcement approached domestic terrorism, highlighted the power of ideas to fuel violence, and raised uncomfortable questions about the costs of technological progress. Today, Kaczynski's cabin sits preserved in a museum, a grim reminder of the silent war he waged against modern society. For those who lived through his reign of terror, the sound of an unexpected package still carries a faint echo of fear. Episode 9. The Move Bombing in Philadelphia. On May 13, 1985, the city of Philadelphia became the site of one of the most controversial domestic attacks in American history, not by extremists, but by the government itself. That morning, police engaged in a tense standoff with MOVE, a radical black liberation group that had long clashed with city officials. The group lived communally in a row house on Osage Avenue, advocating for natural living and railing against what they saw as systemic oppression. Neighbors, however, complained of neglect, loudspeaker rants, and confrontations with authorities. Tensions escalated until city leaders decided to act. What followed was extraordinary. After hours of gunfire between police and MOVE members barricaded inside, authorities made a fateful decision. They dropped a satchel bomb from a helicopter onto the building's roof. The explosion ignited a fire that quickly spread, consuming the house and, ultimately, the entire block. 11 people inside the MOVE home, including 5 children, died in the inferno. 65 houses in the neighborhood were destroyed, leaving more than 250 people homeless. The images shocked the nation. Flames engulfing an American neighborhood, black smoke curling into the sky, and residents fleeing as their homes burned. Survivors recalled the horror of watching loved ones trapped inside the fire, while others stood helpless as everything they owned vanished in minutes. The city's decision to let the fire burn rather than extinguish it immediately remains one of the most heavily criticized choices in modern policing history. The MOVE bombing raised profound questions about race, power, and the limits of government authority. Many saw it as an assault not only on MOVE, but on an entire community, revealing how far officials were willing to go to silence dissent. Investigations and commissions later condemned the city's actions, but no officials were ever criminally charged. To this day, the tragedy is remembered as a grim example of state violence, carried out against its own citizens. Yet, despite its scale, the MOVE bombing is rarely mentioned in mainstream accounts of terrorism. Perhaps it is because it forces Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth, that sometimes the terror comes not from outsiders, but from those in power. The ruins of Osage Avenue stand as a scar on Philadelphia's history, a reminder of how a government meant to protect can also destroy. And in the silence surrounding it, we glimpse the fragility of trust between people and the institutions that govern them. Episode 10. The Forgotten Los Angeles Times Bombing. In the early hours of October 1, 1910, downtown Los Angeles was jolted awake by a massive explosion that ripped through the Los Angeles Times building. The blast, caused by a suitcase packed with dynamite, ignited fires that engulfed the structure. 21 employees were killed, most of them trapped in the inferno, and more than 100 others were injured. At the time, it was one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in U.S. history. Yet today, it is almost entirely forgotten outside of labor history circles. The bombing was tied to the bitter conflicts between labor unions and powerful industrialists. The Los Angeles Times, led by publisher Harrison Gray Otis, was staunchly anti-union, frequently attacking organized labor in its pages. In retaliation, two brothers, James and John McNamara, connected to the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers, plotted to strike back. Their decision to target the Times was meant as a message to capitalists, but instead, it became a tragedy that horrified the nation. Eyewitnesses recalled scenes of chaos, workers leaping from windows to escape flames, others clawing through smoke-filled corridors, and rescue crews pulling bodies from the smoldering rubble. The attack shocked a city that was rapidly growing into a major American metropolis, and it sent ripples across the country as the labor movement was suddenly linked to mass violence. The investigation that followed was dramatic and politically charged. The McNamara brothers were eventually arrested, and labor leader Samuel Gompers faced immense pressure as the entire movement was put under suspicion. When the brothers confessed, public sympathy for organized labor collapsed in many quarters. For decades, the bombing was used as a symbol of how far extremism within the labor movement could go, even though many union members opposed such violence. Today, the Los Angeles Times bombing is rarely mentioned in conversations about terrorism. Yet its impact was profound. It reshaped public perceptions of unions, hardened the city's political climate, and left behind scars that influenced labor struggles for generations. The ruins of the Times building were rebuilt, but the memory of the 21 lives lost slowly faded into history. The Forgotten Los Angeles Times bombing stands as a chilling reminder that terrorism in America has taken many forms: political, ideological, racial, religious, and economic. Each story we've uncovered across these episodes reveals truths that challenge the common narrative. Terrorism on U.S. soil is not a new phenomenon, nor is it always foreign. It has been part of America's story for over a century, carried out by outsiders, insiders, and even those in power. And perhaps the most shocking truth of all is how easily these tragedies are erased, buried under newer headlines, left as faint scars on buildings and memories. But if we listen closely, the echoes of these forgotten attacks tell us something urgent, that the battle against terror is not just about security or politics, it is about remembering, so history does not repeat itself.